So, to summarize what I've been trying to say about failure, basically it doesn't matter, does it? If we see it as a whole, failure has a giftedness about it. If we take it in isolation, and that's, of course, the narrow path, is that you do focus on failure, as a loss of hope, as a loss of integrity, or a feeling of waste, or a feeling of shame or guilt at the time. In the midst of the failure, that's what you feel. That's the cross. I was just speaking this morning to Anne MacDonald, who's, as you know, many of you will know, has a terminal illness, and she shared very richly, beautifully with the community from this journey that she's been on with her husband and with the community. And she recently was told that she wouldn't be up to having any more chemotherapy. So she's entering a new stage, and she says, really, all I can do is to be in the present moment. And I said, yes, but you have been in the present moment since this started, since she accepted it. And so, of course, what happens is we simply go deeper into the present moment. We go through a cycle. Life is about cyclical. Growth is cyclical. Failure, success, life, death, light, shade, morning, night. Last year, a foolish monk. This year, the same, no change. So we go through the cycles of growth, but we're not treading water. We're not regressing. We're not even staying in the same place. We are going deeper. So, as I've said before, failure is endemic, it's unavoidable, so we have to make the most of it. We make the world according to the kind of attention we give to the world. There's the attention of a sniper who has got his victim in his sights. I think perhaps the word concentration would be better to describe that, but it's a very focused kind of attention. But then there is the attention that a mother gives her child, or a friend to a friend, or a lover to a lover. There is another kind of attention which makes another world, or reveals another world. When it comes with love. There is the kind of self-fixated attention that we see in the poet of love, the poem of Herbert, as he is fixated on himself in his unworthiness. It's a certain kind of attention, but it's a very egocentric attention. And then there is the other kind of attention, which is the attention of love to him, that is faithful and enduring and persevering and all the things that St. Paul says that love is. So we make the world, and we remake the world, or we redeem the world according to the kind of attention we give it. As we saw when we looked at the structure of the brain, and I think one of the principles of anatomy and medicine is that structure is always associated with function, that if things are structured in a certain way, it's because they have a certain kind of function. So we are wired for duality, and the two hemispheres of the brain set us up for this. And although it creates some problems, a conflict of interest, there are different ways of looking at the world, we're also wired for a single vision, for a contemplative vision, for a non-dualistic way of seeing the world as one, and as ourselves as one with the world. And that's a kind of vision that Jesus, of course, embodies and expresses in the last farewell discourses of the Last Supper, where he sees and prays for the unity that he has with the Father, the ground of being, and that same unity that he has with the Father, he gives to us, so that where he is, we will be, so that that all may be one. A great prayer of oneing, which is also how the Cloud of Unknowing in the 14th century speaks about the work of meditation as a work of oneing, becoming one, making one. So we have this relationship between duality, the two ways of looking at the world, for example, success and failure, me and them. But we also have this capacity for an integrated, unified vision, which is the way God sees us. This is the vision of God. There's an ambiguity in that phrase, the vision of God. Does it mean the way God sees, or does it mean our way of seeing God? So the vision of God must include both God's vision or knowledge of us and our knowledge or vision of God. That we may know as fully as we are known is how St. Paul puts it. At present, he says, we see through a glass darkly. We see through a cracked mirror or a cracked pane of glass. Or those of you who wear glasses know what it's like when you have a scratch on your glasses. So we see with a certain distortion. But the day will come, the day is coming, the day is when we will see as fully as we are seen. We will know as fully as we are known. So we're wired for this duality just because of the structure of our brain, but we are also capable of love. We have a capacity for love. We are capax Dei. We are capable of God. And this love, this experience of love, and remember the poem doesn't use the word God, the poem just uses love, is what divinizes us. Love divinizes us. The experience of love, however we manage to find it, enjoy it, live it, is divinizing. Saint Benedict says at the beginning of the prologue that the monk, all of us, must open our eyes, or we're called to open our eyes to the divinizing light. And this is at the heart of the Christian vision of reality, is that we are destined, we are called, we are capable of divinization. There's nothing new about that. The earliest Christian theologians said God became human so that human beings might become God. So this is why we exist. Only in love can we truly see what is, because love is this medium, or is the context, the experience, if you like, in which we do see things whole as one. St. John says that whoever loves knows God. Maybe they don't even believe in God, but they know God. Imagine you were just parachuted in from somewhere, and you had no knowledge of where you were coming. You'd never heard of Italy. So you just found yourself in the middle of Tuscany, with the wine, with the food, and with the beautiful views. Well, you would know Tuscany, but you wouldn't know what you know. You wouldn't have a name for it. But would you know it? Yes. You would actually want to know more about it. What's the history of this place, and what are the people like, and what language do they speak, and what's its name? But the actual experience would be the experience. So, whoever loves knows God and lives in God, St. John says, whereas those who are unloving, even if they believe in God and speak the God language and are, fully paid up members, they know nothing of God if they are unloving. Now, love requires something at any level. Blake said, "We are put upon this earth a little space to learn to bear the beams of love." So from our earliest moments of consciousness, or even pre-consciousness perhaps, we are learning to love. And learning to love, as we were sharing with each other the other day, learning to love requires that we have at least some experience of being loved. It will be difficult for us, not impossible, but it would be very difficult for us to love without having realized at some point, even briefly and imperfectly, that we are loved, that someone, somewhere, for whatever reason, has loved us. And that's the basic teaching of the gospel. Love each other. Love each other as I have loved you. So there is a meaning, according to Julian of Norwich, the meaning of everything is love. She looked at the world, she had this vision of the world, this unified vision. She saw the world as if it were a hazelnut in the palm of her hand. It's kind of a mystical vision of the unity of things. And then she said, well, what's the meaning of it all? Remember that question I asked the MBA student. At a certain point, this question of meaning isn't philosophical or intellectual or theological, it's existential. I need to know the meaning. I need to know it so that I can cope with failure and get through that part of the cycle of growth which we call failure or loss or death or mortality, which we can't avoid but which is devastating at the time. So I actually need to know the meaning of things in order to be able to continue to grow, to evolve through this cycle of human life. And so Mother Julian says, love is my meaning. Unity is the meaning. So, love can be said to be the meaning, and I don't think there are many people who would deny that if they had the choice between love and wealth or power or good looks or the fulfillment of all their desires, if you had to choose between all of that and love, I think we would probably, at least at this point, say, I would choose love. And if we didn't, we would pretty quickly realize our mistake. So, but what does love demand? we see from the poem that love is a very demanding force, especially when it's coming directly from the source, and in any form, actually, in any expression, love demands everything. Julian of Norwich describes meditation as that condition of complete simplicity, unity, that condition of complete simplicity that demands not less than everything. So love requires a complete and unconditional surrender of ourselves, a letting go, a death, or a leaving of self behind. In the poem, we can sense that this is being asked of us, of the poet, of the narrator. He's putting up a struggle to keep hold of himself, even though it's a negative view of himself. We often fight tooth and nail to protect our self-rejection, because our self-rejection, even our self-hatred, becomes a kind of protection against the world. I won't be hurt again. Put up my barriers. And so we fight to protect what actually is causing us the worst kind of pain. So love is relentless in the poem in breaking down this very powerful force of the ego of trying to survive, to protect itself, even in its negativity. But there's another side to this. What about love? The love that is relentlessly bearing down upon the ego self and whittling it away and dissolving it and challenging it. Well, that love has already surrendered. That love, God love, has already unconditionally surrendered itself, its dignity, its self-importance to that which it is giving attention, that which it loves. And so we have this image of Simone Weil that I mentioned of seeing God as a beggar, or the image that Jesus uses in the prodigal son of the father, the patriarchal sheikh, responding to the return of the prodigal son with an abandonment of his own dignity. He runs across the fields to embrace his returning son. So God has no pride. God is humble. And that is the authority with which Jesus speaks, that we thought about yesterday at Mass. He spoke with authority, unlike the other teachers. That authority was also interpreted as blasphemy or as pride or as megalomania by those who didn't understand him, because it's a very powerful and ultimately undeniable authority, one that we have to respect. And this humility of God, we could say, is explicit and human in Jesus. So we could say Jesus is the humility of God. And especially if we think of the word humility as including the sense of earthly humus, the incarnation. We can only really see the meaning of failure, the gift it carries, from a place of poverty. Unless we're in that place of humility, failure will always trigger our ego, our pride, and our self-rejection, our shame and our guilt. It's only when we've really got into this place of surrender, of having sold everything, as it says in the parables, he sold everything to buy this treasure. It's only in that place of radical simplicity, of unconditional simplicity, of humility, of poverty of spirit, that we can see the place of failure in the cycle of our growth. Otherwise, we'll only see it as a failure. We won't see it as a gift taking us to the next stage of the cycle. Poverty means non-clinging. It's a place of non-possessiveness. It could also be said, from a meditator's point of view, to mean silence. And silence, as we discover in the work of meditation, means the laying aside of thoughts, good thoughts and bad thoughts. And this is the hard work and the narrow way that leads through the funnel into life. Because we are incessantly chattering in our heads. It's bad enough on a silent retreat when we chatter unnecessarily with each other, but that's only the expression of the internal chatter in our minds. We're chattering constantly with ourselves, monitoring, judging, evaluating, planning, predicting, judging. It's just endless. Sometimes we have a few good conversations with ourselves. We actually hear something interesting, but that's relatively rare. Most of the time it's nice day today. Nice tomatoes. Or funny looking person, that. So most of the time the chatter is pretty and yet what's amazing is, isn't it, that although it's pretty useless, most of it, and we wouldn't miss it if we lost it, nevertheless, we cling to it for dear life. We are terrified at the idea of the chatter stopping, because where the hell would we be? Well, we have moments, of course, which keep us going and keep us meditating, where we do realize that we do actually arrive somewhere very wonderful and where we really belong when the chatter stops. Because this chatter is really trivial. And it actually gets in the way of our communication with each other. It actually prevents us from saying, most of the time, anything meaningful to each other. This chatter can be so loud, so obsessive, compulsive, and fascinating in the sort of way that millions of people seem to find, what do they call it, Big Brother fascinating, or a very low-level soap opera. This can be so intense that it does actually prevent us from speaking sense or speaking anything meaningful. I mean, most of the time, or much of the time, it's as if we're reading the newspaper upside down. when you look at, I can't read any of this. I can't read it when it's the other way up, actually. But I try to read it when it's upside down. It just is nonsense. So all we need to do is metanoia. Just change the way the mind is directing itself, and things begin to become clearer. We begin to make sense of things and to see the way things are connected, the way the words are part of sentences, and the sentences part of paragraphs, and the paragraphs part of chapters, and the chapters part of books. I mean, that's a literary version of it. But those of you...
How do you spell metanoia? How do you spell metanoia?
Metanoia. Pleasure. So we have this incessant chatter going on in our minds about ourselves. I mean, the chatter concerns and involves a lot of thoughts about other people, but ultimately it's rather self-referring chatter most of the time. And of course this is what makes us unmindful. This is why we can be in a place and not be there. We can be with a person but not pay attention to them. We can act with quite extraordinary egoism, self-centeredness, just not aware that what we're doing or saying is interfering or upsetting or discourteous to others. I mean, when you're living in a big city and you're traveling on the metro or the underground in the rush hour, you know, it's rather like that. It's the survival of the fittest. You're not usually very mindful of the other people around you. So that crowd of thoughts is in our minds. Monte said that pain is the color of certain events. Pain is the color of certain events. There is some pain involved in turning the page the right way round, in turning our attention to the world in another way. There's a certain pain involved in that change of direction. It's like probably if cars could feel pain, they would probably feel a certain pain when you turn the wheel. And some of us here have been in or are in physical pain, which colors the way you see things. And of course, we need help, we need compassion, we need sympathy to go through it. But it's not the end of the story. There is a more integrated way of seeing even the place of pain in the cycle of growth. And growth is that moving beyond the dualistic, success, failure way of judging the world to the integral, holistic, single vision of God. Monte says that joy and suffering, we could say success and failure, joy and suffering are two equally precious gifts. Well, you might say, well, for you, maybe. But she speaks wisdom. She says both of them must be fully tasted. The word wisdom comes from the Latin word to taste, or the Latin word for wisdom comes with that meaning of tasting, sapere. Each one in its purity and without trying to mix them. So in other words, failure is failure. Success is success. Birth is birth. Death is death. The ending of a certain kind of medical treatment is the end of that medical treatment. So there are, events in life have their own particular and peculiar identity and meaning. So we can't deny there is failure, or deny that there is death. If we do that, we just mix ourselves up worse. Through joy, she says, the beauty of the world penetrates our soul. Through suffering, it penetrates our body. The body plays a part in all apprenticeships. She uses this image of a message. Been reading about angels, messengers in the readings at Mass the last few days. She says, when joy or suffering come, we have to open the very center of our soul to it, as a woman opens her door to messengers from her beloved. What does it matter to a lover if the messenger is courteous or rough, as long as he gives her the message? Well, that's a hard saying, but it's hard like many of the sayings of Jesus. And it's hard in the sense of the story of the gospel itself. And getting to this point of view, where we are equally detached from failure and success, but also equally open and equally realistic about failure or success. You've got the right kind of distance. Getting to that point of view is, for all of us, a long, narrow way. But it leads to life. Life as a true perception of reality, which fills us with abundance or fullness of life and opens us actually beyond all limitations, all the limitations imposed by duality. It opens us to the inclusive interconnectedness, the total unity, the web of relationship, which is the world and all it contains. So let's go and get acquainted with the world again. So the trick is then to see that there is a cycle going on, that we're wired for this, that we live in this alternation of states, the two hemispheres of the brain, two ways of paying attention, and that there is a cycle that we are growing through, and even though we may seem to be covering the same ground over many years, we are actually not regressing. We are allowing ourselves to be led through these cycles of growth, of death and life, death and rebirth. So where is resurrection in this? Resurrection is, I would say, the if you like, the transcendence or the overcoming or the passing through of that cycle of death and rebirth. Resurrection is that state of being, of life, in which contains the cycles, the dualities. It's the state of oneness which resolves the dualities. And the resurrection of the gospel, of the story of Jesus, is a manifestation of what we are all involved in, what we are all going to experience, what we are all wired for and destined for. And therefore, our understanding of the resurrection of Jesus, difficult particular example of this for us to accept or to believe, and perhaps it is unbelievable, and we have to relate to it in some other way rather than just through belief, but we have to relate to it through faith. What is faith? Well, ever been in love? You know what faith is. Faith is fidelity, relationship. So we relate to this unbelievable event of the resurrection in faith. Faith is our capacity for relationship, for commitment, for self-transcendence, for moving to that other kind of attention. And as we relate to that manifestation of the resurrection of Jesus, and let's not pretend that that's an easy thing to do, and most people won't do it, but if we do relate to that, then it is definitely going to change us. It's going to have a profound effect upon us, as it did upon the disciples who experienced it in the New Testament stories, and in those strange, mysterious, right brain kind of stories describing the resurrection appearances. What happens? They are sent back into life in a new way. They are no longer held in the fear of failure, their own failure, or the failure of Jesus, as it must have seemed to them. They're no longer controlled by the fear of death, which is the opposite of life, and therefore what we fear most. So they are energized with a completely new kind of attention to the world. And they live this life in a new way. They don't become angels, they still have their hang-ups, they still have their problems. They know themselves better, but that may involve quite a lot of hard work, because they know aspects of themselves they didn't want to know before, maybe. But they are sent back, we are sent back through this relationship to live this life in a new way. And of course, we go through the same cycles for a period of time. Of course, we go through those cycles, failure and success. We will lose love at times. We will lose the people we love at times. We will fail in our hopes and dreams and aspirations at times. And at other times we will find love, we will be remade, and we will be healed, and we will succeed. So we will continue to go through these cycles, because that is what life is in this dimension, but we will go through those cycles with a new way of seeing, a new kind of attention, a new way of relating to it. So this is, I think, what the poem brings us to at the end. So are you ready for the ultimate comment on the new model of love, the new Pergio model? So what we've seen in this very short and simple poem is something that gives is a glimpse into a very intense conversation, an intense struggle between two kinds of attention. The attention that is fixated on ourselves as failures, unworthy, held back by guilt, the guilt of dust and sin, and also, as he says here, shame, guilt and shame. A poet like Herbert doesn't use those words ill-advisedly. There's the guilt that has this personal paralyzing effect upon us, and then there is the shame, the sense of being unable to relate to others or to the decent values of the world. So, where we left off yesterday, love makes the next move and takes his hand. A very clear move on love's part. There's a touch now, not just looking, but touching. And as those who care for the dying will say, that there are times when there is nothing else for you to say to someone who is dying or someone who's very seriously ill. But at this point, especially, your physical touch is very important. And so they will advise you, don't do it in the way that the English would do it, which would be just sort of make bare contact, frightened of it or getting into trouble. But make sure that they feel it, because they may not be feeling very much at that moment. So make it a definite contact. So I think this is what we're hearing here. Love took my hand. And smiling. So with this touch, there's no embarrassment. Love isn't saying, I wonder how far I can go. There's a smile here which represents the absolute authority of love and the self-confidence of love. Love knows what it's doing at this point. And he says, who made the eyes but I? Because I have just said, I cannot even look on you, on thee. So I'm not worthy to be here, and I'm wriggling to keep my self in my self-rejected isolation, because that's where I feel I belong, that's where my guilt and shame have put me, and that's where I also, as it happens, feel safe. Because I've got so used to paying attention to the world with this kind of perspective, I don't want to change. I know where I am. I know who I am. I'm not going to change anymore. I'm just setting myself up for more disappointment, more failure, if I let go of this space, this place. So this is where redemption happens. We are redeemed by love. Saved by love, healed by love. And as John Main said, when you look at the crucifix, you shouldn't just see the suffering of Christ and say, I am saved by the pain that Christ endured, the sort of Mel Gibson theology of that film, of this obsessive obsession with the physical pain and suffering, which very easily becomes perverted and sadistic, as it has done in certain kinds of Christian art or culture. But don't focus, and actually, and of course the accounts of the Passion of Jesus don't linger on the physical pain. Of course, it must have hurt, but they don't linger on the pain. What they linger on is the love, is the attention with which Jesus went through this final cycle of failure, ultimate failure, and how he maintained his attention in a loving and forgiving way and a truthful way. So, this is the redemption that is being described in this poem. It's the redemption of the attention, the unfailing, faithful, enduring attention of love from its source, from its unprovable reality towards us in our particularity and uniqueness. You can't prove it, but why should you prove it? Who are you proving it to? If you can experience it, if you can feel it, then, why do you have to prove it? Scientists have to prove their research material and products, but they don't have to prove to anybody that they love their husbands, wives, or children. So, love continues its campaign. Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. I have spoiled my eyes. So the last attempt to say no to the invitation. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. So this I am so unworthy of what you are offering me that just let me go to hell, which is where I am anyway. So just let me stay here. It's safe. It's where and my only consolation is the idea that I am not letting go of. My only consolation is the idea that this is where I should be. This is where I deserve to be. And then the final response of love which is his ace card. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame. So at this point, love is not arguing with him anymore. He's not saying, you're a really good guy. You've made a few mistakes, but don't worry. I forgive you. I'll make up for it. I'll cover up for you. I'll pay your debt. He's saying, I have, of course, if that's how you feel, if that's how you interpret your own failures, so be it, but I'm carrying that totally. So actually, you can't use this feeling of failure or shame or guilt as an excuse for refusing what I am giving you. And I'm not just offering it to you, now I'm giving it to you. And this is the meaning of redemption. Now, it's much easier, and it protects our ego in this image of ourselves as unworthy and as sinful, and keeps us focused in upon ourselves, if we think of redemption as simply some kind of paying off of a debt that is owed. But the meaning of redemption here in the gospel is a complete, unconditional, faithful identification of God, the source of being and the source of love, with us. Complete identification. So at this point now, there's no argument. You can't argue with this. Love is saying, I accept you entirely, even with your self-rejection, I accept you. I make your self-rejection part of what I accept. So you can't use your self-rejection to reject me. because I'm accepting that self-rejection. So it's such a radical move that we are caught. But he says one last attempt to maintain some shred of his ego identity. He says, my dear, second time, isn't it? He uses this, my dear. Maybe there's a different tone here. Maybe you could sense that the ego is beginning to be dissolved, is breaking down. Maybe there is a tenderness in this, my dear, compared with the first one, which, as we suggested, or I thought was a little bit more fake. But anyway, my dear, the poet says to love, then I will serve. I will be your servant. And I'm still not worthy enough to accept the gift of your acceptance. Therefore, I'll come in to the dinner, but I will be the waiter. Okay? Do you know people like that? People who will always put themselves in this role of the giver, the server, the doer, the Martha, with great generosity, with great skill sometimes, and yet can be totally manipulative in the way they do it. It's a trick that we play on ourselves. It's the wrong, it's an inadequate response. Because it isn't only about giving, it's also about receiving. And this cycle of failure and success could also be expressed, is expressed in the cycle of love itself, which is about giving and receiving. It isn't enough just to give. That could be the last attempt you make to keep love at a distance, to prevent the union, the oneness from happening. You stay on the outside, maybe as a martyr even, but you remain separate. And the final blow, in a sense, the death blow in this relationship is love saying, no, you sit down and I will serve you. My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. So love is now being very strong. There is the commandment of love here. And it's not as we think from our ego perspective, telling us that we must love, that we must give, that we must sacrifice ourselves. All of those are relatively easy for the ego to do. But the commandment of love, as it is reaching us at this place of our resistance, is saying, you must be loved. You must accept this. You must sit down and taste my meat. So, this is where the Eucharistic imagery of the poem suddenly reveals itself very explicitly, as we noticed yesterday. This is where we begin to see that in the Eucharist, in the sacrament or the sign of the Eucharist, we are receiving something. We are being there. Of course, you don't receive it if you're not there, but you're being there, and you're not, as it were, so much giving your time or fulfilling an obligation or going through an empty ritual because this is what you had to do as a child. All of that dissolves, and you begin to realize in the light of meditation that you are actually receiving this inflow of love for no other reason than that love wants to give it. And so this is why, as I was saying earlier, our meditation and our understanding of the Eucharist in the Christian vision is essentially the same. We are sitting down, we are sitting there, we are being here, and from deep within us, of course, allowing this inflow to happen. And that is what gradually builds up as the level of that life of love builds up within us. It lifts us like a rising tide. And over time, sometimes in unique moments, but generally over time, over years, that tide lifts us up. And where does it bring us? It brings us to a level place where we are in that oneness that Jesus saw and wished and wishes for us. Good. So let's make our way up to the meditation room now.